Somewhere beneath a limestone cave in Cheddar Gorge, England, lay the 10,000-year-old skeleton of a man whose bones held a secret nobody expected. When scientists finally sequenced his DNA in 2018, they discovered something that shattered almost everything popular imagination believed about the earliest people of Britain and the deep ancestors of everyone who would eventually call Scotland home. Cheddar Man, as researchers named him, had dark brown to black skin, dark curly hair, and strikingly blue eyes. Not the pale, ruddy, red-haired image most people picture when they think of ancient Britain. A combination of features so unexpected that it forced historians and geneticists alike to admit something uncomfortable, that the true genetic story of the people who eventually became the Scots, the Picts, the Gaels, and everyone else layered into the identity of modern Scotland was far stranger, far more violent, and far more surprising than anything written in the old myths and legends passed down for centuries. So if you think you already know where Scottish people came from, stay with me, because the DNA tells a completely different story, one written in waves of replacement, disappearance, migration, and identity theft on a scale that almost nobody realizes actually happened. Let's start at the very beginning, because you cannot understand modern Scotland without understanding just how many times its population was almost completely wiped out and replaced by newcomers. After the last ice age ended, roughly 11,700 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers crossed a land bridge that once connected Britain to continental Europe, arriving in a cold, wild, heavily forested landscape and slowly spreading northward into what is now Scotland. These were the people related to Cheddar Man, dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers who lived off the land for thousands of years, developing their own culture, their own tools, their own way of surviving in one of the harshest corners of Europe. And then, roughly 6,000 years ago, everything changed. Farmers originating from the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, began a massive migration into Europe known as the Neolithic Revolution, bringing agriculture, permanent settlements, an entirely new genetic ancestry with them. When these farmers reached Britain, genetic studies show they almost completely replaced the original overwhelming majority of ancestry to the people who would go on to build massive stone monuments across the British landscape, including the very people responsible for constructing Stonehenge. But here is where the story takes its first genuinely shocking turn, because those Neolithic farmers, the very people who built one of the most famous monuments in human history, were themselves almost completely erased just a few centuries later. Around 2450 BC, a new wave of migrants began arriving in Britain, associated with a very distinctive style of bell-shaped pottery, giving them the name Bell Beaker people. Geneticist David Reich and his team at Harvard sequenced ancient DNA from over 100 individuals across Britain and the near continent, and what they found was described by researchers as almost complete population replacement. Within just a few hundred years of the Beaker migration, reaching British shores, more than 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool, the DNA of the very people who built Stonehenge, was gone, replaced entirely by the genetic signature of these new arrivals. Some researchers studying the archaeological record even suspect the replacement may have been driven partly by disease, theorizing that the Beaker migrants may have carried a plague-like illness that devastated a Neolithic population with no immunity to it, clearing the way for a genetic and cultural takeover so thorough that later British and Irish skeletons carried, at most, around 10% ancestry from the original farming population that had lived there for over a millennium. And where did these Beaker people actually come from originally? For decades, this was one of the biggest open questions in European prehistory. But recent ancient DNA research traced their ultimate genetic roots back even further, to nomadic herders called the Yamnaya, who originated on the vast steppe grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas in what is now Russia and Ukraine. About 5,300 years ago, these steppe herders began an extraordinary migration that geneticists now believe stretched from the Atlantic coast of Europe all the way to Mongolia in the east and India in the south, one of the largest population expansions in human prehistory, made possible by their mastery of horses and wheeled transport. This migration is now believed to explain the spread of Indo-European languages across an enormous portion of the globe, and it planted the genetic and linguistic seeds that would eventually shape nearly every culture across Europe, Scotland included. So when you trace the deep ancestry of a modern Scottish person back far enough, you're not looking at one continuous population quietly evolving in isolation on a cold northern island. You're looking at the layered aftermath of repeated, almost total genetic takeovers. Hunter, gatherers overwhelmed by farmers, farmers overwhelmed by steppe, descended migrants, each wave arriving, dominating, and rewriting the genetic identity of the land almost entirely. Now let's fast forward to one of the most mysterious and misunderstood peoples in all of Scottish history, the Picts. the so-called painted people who fiercely resisted the Roman Empire and successfully kept Roman legions from ever fully conquering the northern part of Britain. For centuries, historians told wildly different stories about where the Picts actually came from. The earliest written account, penned by the Anglo-Saxon scholar Bede in the year 731, claimed the Picts had migrated all the way from Scythia, a distant region near the northern coast of the Black Sea, arriving in Britain by sea after a long and exotic journey. Other historical theories placed their origin in Thrace in southeastern Europe, or even on remote islands far to the north of Britain. For over 1,000 years, nobody could definitively prove or disprove any of these dramatic origin stories, and the mystery became so notoriously difficult to solve that archaeologists eventually gave it a name of its own, the Pictish problem. Then, in 2023, researchers finally cracked it open using ancient DNA extracted directly from Pictish burial sites in Scotland. Scientists sequenced whole genomes from skeletons excavated at 2 Pictish cemeteries, comparing the results against more than 8,300 previously published ancient and modern genomes from across Europe. And the results were almost anticlimactic compared to the centuries of exotic legend, and yet somehow even more fascinating precisely because of how ordinary and local the truth turned out to be. The Picts were not exotic foreign invaders from the Black Sea or the eastern Mediterranean at all. Genetically, they matched closely with Iron Age populations already living in Britain, direct descendants of the same broad genetics, sea lineage that had inhabited the island for well over 1,000 years before Rome even existed as a threat to anyone. The entire romantic mystery of a distant, foreign, mysterious tribe arriving from Scythia turned out to be nothing more than a myth, likely invented by later writers trying to explain a culture they simply did not understand. But the genetic story of the Picts held 2 more twists that genuinely surprised the researchers involved. For centuries, historians believed the Picts operated as a matrilineal society, meaning that titles, land, and inheritance passed down through the mother's bloodline rather than the father's, an idea largely based on ambiguous historical texts and a general sense that Pictish culture must have been unusually different from its neighbors. When researchers analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of individuals buried together in Pictish cemeteries, expecting to find close maternal relatives clustered together as evidence of this matrilineal structure, they found something odd instead. The individuals buried together showed no direct maternal ancestry connecting them at all. This unexpected finding actually challenges the old matrilineal theory, and researchers now believe the more likely explanation is that women were being exchanged between different Pictish groups, moving from community to community, much as we see in other ancient societies across Britain and Europe, rather than entire family lines being organized strictly around motherhood and staying rooted in one place. The second twist involves a detail that connects the ancient Picts directly to people walking around Scotland today. Researchers identified a very specific and rare genetic marker on the Y chromosome, a marker known as R1b S530, which is concentrated almost exclusively in central and northeastern Scotland, precisely the historic heartland of ancient Pictland. This exact genetic marker has never been found anywhere else outside the British Isles, strongly suggesting it originated among the original Pictish population, and has remained rooted in that same region for roughly 3,000 years. Even more remarkably, researchers found that this Pictish genetic marker is still carried today by approximately 7% of Scottish men, meaning the so-called vanished, mysterious Picts, a people who supposedly disappeared from history sometime around the 9th or 10th century, never actually disappeared at all. Their bloodline simply absorbed into the wider population, and their direct male line descendants have likely never migrated far from the exact same corner of Scotland their ancestors called home 3,000 years ago. Somewhere in Scotland right now, there are men walking around whose Y chromosome connects them directly, unbroken, to warriors who once painted their bodies and fought off the might of the Roman Empire. Now let's talk about the group most people assume defines Scottish ancestry more than any other, the Vikings, because this is where the DNA delivers arguably the biggest shock of the entire story. In 2020, researcher Eske Willerslev led the largest genetic study of Viking Age DNA ever conducted, sequencing the whole genomes of 442 individuals recovered from archaeological sites scattered across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Estonia, Ukraine, and Poland. The results completely dismantled the popular image of Vikings that most of us grew up with. For starters, the study found that Vikings were far more genetically diverse than anyone assumed, with significant genetic influence flowing into Scandinavia from southern Europe and Western Asia, even before the Viking Age began. And perhaps the most surprising finding of all, genetic analysis revealed that Vikings actually had a much higher frequency of genes linked to Dark hair, then to the blonde hair so strongly associated with the popular image of Norse warriors, meaning the true face of the Viking Age, according to the DNA itself, looked far less like the golden-haired figures of film and television, and far more genetically diverse and mixed than most people ever imagined. But the discovery that hits closest to home for Scotland specifically involves a burial site on the Orkney Islands, off Scotland's northern coast. Archaeologists had excavated skeletons buried there in unmistakably Norse Viking fashion, interred alongside genuine Viking swords and other unmistakably Scandinavian grave goods, exactly the kind of burial any historian would confidently label as belonging to actual Viking settlers. When researchers finally sequenced the DNA of these individuals, the results were nothing short of stunning. These so-called Vikings buried in Orkney were not genetically Scandinavian at all. Their DNA closely matched present-day Irish and Scottish populations instead. In other words, the researchers had uncovered direct physical proof that Viking identity itself was not something you were simply born into through bloodline. It was something you could adopt, perform, and be buried as, regardless of your actual genetic ancestry. Local Picts and Gaels living on Orkney appear to have culturally transformed into Vikings, embracing Norse weapons, Norse burial customs, and presumably Norse language and social identity, without a single drop of literal Scandinavian DNA running through their veins. Lead researcher Eski Willerslev summarized the discovery bluntly, stating that being a Viking was not limited to people with Scandinavian genetic ancestry, and that the results fundamentally change our understanding of who a Viking actually was. This does not mean actual Scandinavian ancestry never made it into Scotland, because it absolutely did, particularly across the Northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland, regions that endured intensive Norse settlement and control for centuries, and where genetic studies show noticeably elevated Scandinavian ancestry persisting in the population even today. Researchers studying the broader genetic legacy of the Viking Age estimate that the United Kingdom as a whole carries up to 6% detectable Viking DNA in the modern population, a real and measurable genetic fingerprint left behind by centuries of Norse raiding, trading, and settlement. But the Orkney discovery proves something far more interesting than a simple story of Scandinavian migration. It proves that Viking identity in Scotland was, at least in part, a costume, a set of customs and material, culture that local Pictish and Gaelic populations could put on entirely, becoming Vikings in every visible sense while remaining genetically indistinguishable from their non-Viking neighbors. So if the Picts were mostly local, and many so-called Vikings buried in Scotland were not actually Scandinavian at all, what does modern Scottish ancestry actually look like when you strip away all the myths and legends? This is where a massive ongoing genetic research initiative, combining data from projects such as the People of the British Isles Study and the Viking Genes Project based at the University of Edinburgh, has produced one of the most detailed genetic maps ever created of Scotland and the surrounding islands. Researchers compared modern genetic data collected from health studies across Scotland against ancient DNA recovered from historical burial sites, and the resulting picture is less a single unified Scottish identity and more an intricate mosaic, stitched together from the overlapping genetic legacies of Gaels, Picts, Britons, and the Norse, each contributing different proportions of ancestry depending on which specific region of Scotland your family comes from. Regions of Western Scotland carry genetic signatures more closely aligned with ancient Pictish populations and neighbouring groups in Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northern England, while the Orkney and Shetland Islands carry a noticeably heavier genetic imprint from Scandinavian settlers, distinct enough that researchers can still detect it clearly in DNA samples collected from island residents today. Even the Orkney Islands themselves reveal a layered, almost archaeological story when you dig into the genetics generation by generation. Researchers studying Pictish-era genomes recovered specifically from Orkney discovered something remarkable, that pre-Viking Age Orcadian Picts show an extremely high degree of shared ancestry with people living across modern Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Orkney itself, demonstrating substantial unbroken genetic continuity in the islands stretching back nearly 2,000 years, even through the disruption, conquest, and cultural transformation brought by later Norse settlement. In other words, despite centuries of Viking control, despite Orkney becoming so thoroughly Norse-influenced that it did not even formally return to Scottish control until 1468, the deep genetic roots of the original Pictish population never actually disappeared. They persisted underneath every subsequent wave of newcomers, quietly surviving inside the DNA of islanders who, today, might assume their ancestry is overwhelmingly Scandinavian, when in reality it is a genuinely layered blend stretching back to the Iron Age and beyond. There is one more detail buried inside this genetic research that deserves special attention because it reveals something about the lives of women across every single wave of Scotland's ancient population, from the Picts through the Vikings and beyond. Time and again, when researchers examine ancient tDNA looking specifically for patterns of migration, they find the same recurring signature: women moving between communities far more frequently than men. This pattern showed up in the mitochondrial DNA of Pictish burials, where women buried together showed no direct maternal relation, suggesting they had arrived from other groups rather than being born locally. It is a pattern echoed across countless ancient European societies, studied through DNA, where evidence consistently points toward women leaving their birth communities to join their partners elsewhere, while men tended to remain rooted in the territory of their birth for generation after generation. This means that across thousands of years of Scottish prehistory and early history, through Pictish times, through Norse settlement, through every cultural transformation the region experienced, it was very often women who carried genetic diversity across the landscape, forging connections between otherwise separate and rival communities through marriage, migration, and the quiet, largely undocumented movement of ordinary lives that never made it into any written record but left an unmistakable trace in DNA that scientists can still read today. So what does all of this actually mean for the modern idea of what it means to be Scottish? It means the popular story of a single ancient people, the Celts standing proudly unbroken against Roman legions, Viking raiders, and English armies across thousands of unchanged years, simply does not match what the DNA is telling us. The real story is far messier and, honestly, far more compelling. It is a story of hunter-gatherers with dark skin and startling blue eyes, overwhelmed almost entirely by farmers arriving from the Mediterranean. Those farmers, in turn, nearly wiped out and replaced by steppe, descended migrants sweeping in from thousands of miles away in what is now Russia and Ukraine. A supposedly exotic, mysterious tribe called the Picts, turning out to be, genetically, some of the most local and rooted people in the entire story, their bloodline still detectable in Scottish men walking around today. And finally, an entire wave of supposed Viking conquerors turning out, in at least some documented cases, to be local Picts and Gaels who simply adopted Norse culture so completely that archaeologists confidently mislabeled their graves as Scandinavian for well over 1,000 years, until DNA analysis finally exposed the truth hiding underneath the swords and burial customs. Scotland, as it turns out, was never a single unbroken bloodline stretching back into the mists of time. It was never a fortress of pure, unchanging ancestry defiantly resisting outside influence. It was, and still is, a genetic layer cake, built from repeated waves of arrival, conquest, replacement, and quiet. Intermarriage, stretching back through the Vikings, through the Picts, through the Beaker people and the Yamnaya herders who came before them, all the way back to a dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherer whose bones sat undisturbed in an English cave for 10,000 years before finally revealing just how differently our ancestors truly looked, and just how tangled, surprising, and genuinely human the real story of Scottish origins turns out to be. Every person walking through the streets of Edinburgh or Inverness today, whether they know it or not, is carrying inside their own cells a living record of every single one of these ancient collisions, migrations, and quiet acts of survival, a genetic archive far older and far stranger than any legend ever written down. And DNA, unlike myth, does not lie.